All right, folks, so before we can jump into the philosophy of religion, we first have to be introduced to what we call the Western theological tradition. And what is the Western theological tradition? Well, it refers to the theological tradition of Europe, North Africa, and the Americas after about 1600, which incorporates the fusion of Greek and Judeo-Christian religious thought. And for our purposes, we'll just say that the Western tradition is concerned with three major issues: the nature and existence of God, the problem of human salvation, and the relationship between faith and reason. Now, within the Greek and Judeo-Christian traditions, three sources have been especially influential on the Western theological mind: the works of Plato, the works of Aristotle, and the Bible, which is the foundational sacred text of Judaism and Christianity. And Christians divide the Bible into two major sections, what they call the Old Testament and the New Testament. And Jews and Christians share in common what Christians refer to as the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures, while Christians alone include the New Testament in their scriptures. Now, there are five major Western theological beliefs that kind of get into the airwaves in this tradition. One is this idea of monotheism, that there exists one all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good deity, which we call God. Two, that this single God created the world. Third, that human beings are created in God's image, and therefore human beings have like a special relationship with God in comparison to the rest of creation. And that there exists some kind of an afterlife for humans, which is a belief more emphasized by Christians than Jews. And unique to Christians is this belief that Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ, or the Messiah and Son of God. Now, this is important to note. Although we will be referencing some Jewish theological ideas in this class, we will be primarily concerned with the writings of Christian religious thinkers, because it is commentators within this faith that dominate the Western theological tradition. So whether it is right or wrong that Christian commentators kind of dominate philosophy textbooks is, something that's debated. But for the purpose of this class, we will focus primarily on Christian religious thinkers. Now, with that in mind, the Western theological tradition is divided into three major periods of time: the patristic period, the scholastic period, and the modern period. So the patristic period refers to the age of the church fathers, because patristic comes from pater, which means father. And the church fathers were Christians living in the Roman Empire from roughly the 2nd to 10th century CE, who mostly fused together the Greek and biblical traditions. So not all of the church fathers brought Greek philosophy and the Bible together, but a great many of them did. And these church fathers used Greek philosophy to interpret the Bible, create church doctrine, and defend such doctrine against attacks from pagans, heretics, and atheists. So we find in many schools of thought in the patristic period this kind of fusion of Greek philosophy and the biblical tradition to create and defend church doctrine. Now, some famous figures in the patristic period would be people like the Jewish philosopher theologian Philo of Alexandria, as well as the Christian thinkers Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, and St. Augustine, who of course we studied in the last unit. So now let's move on to the scholastic period. So the scholastic period is a tradition that emerged during the medieval period, which used the works of Aristotle to better understand God and God's creation. That is, in the 13th century, during the scholastic period, Aristotle was considered to be the philosopher, like the most influential thinker in the church. And during the scholastic period, philosophy was considered to be the handmaiden of theology, that it was kind of like the servant of theological argument. And probably the heaviest hitter, I guess you could say, of the scholastic period would be St. Thomas Aquinas, who, of course, you read for this week. And again, famous scholastic figure, St. Thomas Aquinas. And now moving into the modern period. So the modern period refers to an era in Western intellectual history beginning in the 17th century and ending in roughly the early 20th century. But again, that's debatable. And modern philosophers are distinguished from the medieval period because it's during the modern period that they began to question some of the assumptions made in the scholastic tradition. And these questions will be felt more or less the following week when we discuss René Descartes. And modern philosophers were heavily influenced by the scientific revolution as well as Enlightenment thought. And some major thinkers that we'll talk about would be people like René Descartes, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Kierkegaard, James, and Charles Darwin. He'll become relevant. Now, this is an important point for us to be aware of. Whereas during the patristic and scholastic periods, philosophy was regarded as an ally to theology, in the modern period, philosophy was often regarded as theology's enemy because philosophers influenced by the scientific revolution and industrialism began to become highly critical of religion and theology. And today, there is a mixed and tense relationship between philosophy and theology. Hence why it's often the case that medieval philosophy is not even taught in philosophy departments. It's taught in religion, theology, or history departments. So, depending upon the university or the college, there does still exist some tension between philosophy and theology departments.